Hi, I'm Jase Smith, co-founder of Mind Your Business. The Mind Your Business programmes were created after years of research into founders' wellbeing and how founders and their business coexist together. What we found is where businesses and the business owners are treated differently, there can be some disconnect, and therefore we need a more holistic approach to business ownership and looking after founder wellbeing. Where we do try and treat the business and the business owner as separate entities, it does run risks to both. In this first episode, we're going to be having a look at national and regional policy around business support and how these might impact on the business owner. In this series of podcasts, we're going to be looking at the reality of business ownerships and what matters to founders and why founders matter. We're going to start this episode by looking at some of the national and regional policies around business ownership, and who better to join us and talk about that but serial entrepreneur, co-founder of Mind Your Business, Professor of Entrepreneurship at Durham University, Mr. Pablo Munoz. So Pablo, welcome to the Founders Matter podcast, and again, thank you for being the first one in the hot seat.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off with the government's backing your business strategy for small businesses. It comes at a time when the North East Growth Fund and Growth Hub are also releasing a lot of their information. And when you look through it, it talks a lot about leadership skills, management skills, how to operate a business and the funding. But Pablo, based on your experience, where should the real focus be on so that founders get the most out of it? And do you think there's a bit of a mismatch between what national and regional policy makers are suggesting founders want and actually what founders really want?
There's a renewal of policies ever so often in programs, but they're very rarely new. Been repeating the same formulas and mimicking what people think it works, but it doesn't reflect the reality of how small business ownership works and how entrepreneurship works. There's a big distance between policy making and what's being promoted and the reality of it. Right. So, for example, a lot of, I think it's operational skills and competences is always relevant. Knowing how to start a business, knowing how to run a business and act as a manager. I think there's too much emphasis on the how to and very little emphasis on the and being, right? So there's a human side. There's a lot of the individual in that business. Normally individuals start businesses in their areas of competence. But not only is it what they know, but it's what they like, what they're passionate about. In a lot of cases, right, they turn passion into business or they turn hobbies into business. It's very, very rare that someone would start a business beyond their domains, right? So the human side is largely missing. There's a lot in the head, and we know from research that future making is a big part of it. So envisioning, visualizing futures and finding a way into that future, right? It's a big part of it. In that sense, intuition plays a massive role, and emotions play a big role, right? And how decisions are made. Therefore, the emotional component is largely missing. There's another thing that I think is problematic. We tend to miss, given the relevance and the pressure we put on entrepreneurs. There's that tendency to self-optimize all the time, right? And since you're constantly moving the goalpost, so you can never get it done, you have a lot of internal demands, but there are things that you're supposed to achieve, things that you're supposed to do. It becomes an obligation rather than a constant improvement. You should do more, you can achieve more, and that creates a lot of problems, right? So a lot of the burnout, and there's a really interesting book called The Burnout Society. It shows how that relentless pursuit of optimization and growth, right, takes a toll on people. It seems like there's no limit to it. So I guess knowing when to stop, how to stop, knowing when to abandon, knowing how much is enough, and knowing when to push back. Right? Because there's a lot of expectations, but they say, you know what, this is enough, right? And these are the limits, and this is how I protect myself, this is how I protect my business. So these are conversations that we haven't yet had, and that very much needed.
So lots of good stuff out there, lots of good stuff being promoted, lots of good stuff being offered, but maybe the human element is not quite there. And I think I'd like to come back to that later on. But the elephant in the room, money. Access to finance is always a pain point for startups, for new founders. In your experience, how well do publicly funded sort of business support programs align with what the founders actually need? And do you think having easier access to funding helps at that early stage, or is there a risk that it promotes this over-optimism when it's not my money, so maybe I take more risks with it?
In a lot of cases, there's too much available, and once you see the number, it's doesn't really look like a good investment. When you play the numbers game, right, so the more you support, the more you're supposed to have at the very end, right? So if I support thousands of companies, startups, I'll end up with X amount of companies. What we're seeing in the data, actually, it doesn't really work that way, because the amount of startups and companies actually transitioning to small businesses and then can grow, that correlates with the size of the economy. So you can throw a lot of money into it, but ultimately you end up with the same amount of companies. So you're creating bubbles of startups, but it doesn't really make a difference down the line. I think there's three problems, right? One is that one. The second one is more the merrier. I think it doesn't really work. A lot of the funding that is available, it's offered at a very early stages. A lot goes into training, support, skills and competences I was mentioning before, with the aim of having more startups. And that it becomes an end in itself. In the Northeast, we're going to create 10,000 startups in however 5 years, right? But what difference does it make, right? So if the result is still the same, it looks good, right? Because we're a startup economy, but makes no difference. So there's a lot of structural issues that we haven't yet solved that need to be solved to be able to get to the point where you have a lot of viable businesses, right, operating in the region. The numbers game, it doesn't really make too much sense to me. Then if you go into later stages when support is really needed, only growth-oriented. So if you're not a growth-oriented business, there's no support for you. So, and that's problematic because that's when support is actually needed, right? So if you're going to transition from a single individual business, you don't want to go into like a 500, but perhaps you want to go into a 5 and keep it contained, small, and grow slowly. You're not going to get funding. If you write like a business plan and you go for funding saying, no, I'm not interested in growing, I'm not interested in, you're never going to get the funding, right? So you have to make a lot of promises. And there's a lot of fiction in it, right, to be able to get that funding. So there are a lot of viable businesses in this region and across the UK, but they don't get the funding because they don't sell stories. So in a lot of cases, it becomes a literacy game, right? And we're seeing that in the data. As long as you know how to write a business plan, you'll likely get the funding. It becomes a skill in itself. So is it really a reflection of the quality of the business? And the other problem is what we're seeing in the data, that excessive amount of funding and support, it creates the impression that this is easy, right? It reduces the barrier to the point where it triggers overconfidence, over-optimism, because it's like anyone can do it, right? And that's the message, anyone can do it. When in reality, well, it's not. And it's not just about the individual as well. I mean, we need to pay attention to the individual, but success is not only explained by the end user of the individual. So there are support structures, and you need a lot of things happening at the same time to be able to create those sort of outcomes. If you have overconfidence, over-optimism, and overestimation of your chances of success, that probably, and it's very likely that decision-making will be as good if you're more grounded, right? And with reality checks. And then the other problem is, because we're supporting early stages, the effect of the intervention, it's very limited. So we only know what happens right after the intervention. They receive funding or they went through an incubation program, so we can only see what happens right after. But down the line, we have no evidence that those programs work.
Interesting. So, yeah, money's important, but maybe needs to be looked at as to when that money is injected into the business. And I absolutely agree that there's an art to bid writing and funding applications, and if you're good at it, you're more likely to succeed regardless of the venture. You mentioned there about growth, and we've got lots of national and regional growth programs, but should growth really be the priority for businesses, given that you said a lot of businesses are quite happy just to get to a certain size and continue as they are?
By itself, no. There's a really, really cool piece of research, I think it's like 15 years ago. Profit first, growth first, right? So currently, the emphasis on is growth first, right? So you just go and prove that you're able to grow by X, because that leads to high performance down the line, right? And this piece of research that I always ask my students to read actually shows the opposite, and the data is very consistent in that sense, right? Profit always wins. And that means that as you're growing the business, you have to make more money than the money you spend. There's something called like cash burning rates, right? You have to burn a lot of cash to be able to grow and go into markets and acquire a lot of markets. And then by itself, it looks like that's a very successful business. But in a lot of the cases, these are very inefficient business models. They just don't work, right? And we're expecting that they'll grow to the point, in terms of valuation, will grow to the point where you can sell, so go for an agreement with a solid exit strategy, but there's no value being created. There's a lot of value being destroyed in the process. The problem is that profits first is a very unattractive strategy if you look from the outside, right? Because these are slow-growing businesses, normally very, very robust, cost structures under control, trying to sort of a secure market, but not in the sense that we're going to expand markets, in the sense that we're going to look after our customers, right, and make sure that they come back. These are solid revenue streams, and that takes time, and that's the issue. If you're going to grow fast, it's a riskier strategy, and what the data again shows is that down the line, they achieve less performance. So performance actually explained by a profit-first strategy.
Grow in line with your profit. And interesting, you touch on the fact that there's a lot of data missing, lots of short-term impact, but no real sort of data on the long-term impact informing some of the strategies and policies. And sort of sticking with that data piece, what the plan does acknowledge is that there's a gap in the data around underrepresented founder groups. So again, based on your experience, what do you think needs to be done to support those underrepresented groups?
So one of the things I like to say, and I have a fair amount of colleagues who support that idea, that entrepreneurship is a study of diversity. And you see across the world how diverse the world of entrepreneurship is, right? In terms of individuals and how you do it and how you start up and how you go about things, right? So the different interests, different ambitions, and different contexts, right? So even across this region, if you go into Northumberland, so you see a very different reality if you go into the centre of Newcastle. Even within Newcastle, right? So if you go to the west end of Newcastle, very different reality. And we've created this image of what an entrepreneur should look like, right? And we're all supposed to behave and speak and say the same amount of things. The one-size-fits-all doesn't really work. It's very effective when it comes to the design and delivery of programs, but very ineffective when it comes to performance, right? Because you're not paying attention to diversity and how contextualized that agency is, right? So it's largely shaped by context and life circumstances. And that is the other problem, right? So if there's an overemphasis on agency, so people think that if you support the entrepreneur, problem solved. It's like a silver bullet. But it doesn't really happen that way, because what the data is showing is that if you don't, for example, in the case of underrepresented groups and like ethnic minorities or prisoners, using entrepreneurship in many different ways. So the belief is that as long as you support the individual, it's like problem solved. But what the data is showing is that if you don't change or don't work with the structural conditions that support that individual, like, and this is not just in the business support industries, it's not business coaches, right? So I think it's broader issues that we need to address, but the chances of success are very limited. There's a cool piece of research that came out, I would say 10 years ago, looking into 40 years of enterprise policies in the UK, address issues like poverty, right, through entrepreneurship, and the answer is still the same. No, it's not a silver bullet. It's that like panacea myth, right? So by itself, we think that can do a lot, but in reality, it can do very little. From the point of view of the individual, these are the expectations that the individual see and feel and experience. So you're supposed to achieve a lot, and by itself, you can achieve very little.
If it was that easy to just become a founder and be very, very successful very quickly, we'd all be founders, wouldn't we? I suppose. Yeah, interesting. And if the government had asked you, for your opinion, your thoughts, what would be the one thing that you would encourage them to have in their strategy that would make it more founder friendly and more sort of reflective of what founders really need to help them succeed?
Well, it's not just one thing. It cannot be one thing.
Is that the problem, that we think there is just one thing?
It's very difficult to think about systems and appreciate the complexity of systems and keep systems in your mind, right, all the time. But if I can offer a piece of advice, I think is look at the evidence. People think, well, we do evidence-based policy making. In reality, they do policy-based evidence making. So evidence being produced as they're trying to sort of sort out things. It's not that they wing it, right? I'm not saying that. But there's a reason why there's a misalignment between reality evidence and what's being created at the policy level. And I think if they pay attention to the evidence, decisions might change. The problem is that the evidence is not so attractive. So you wouldn't have been able to sell probably anything on the back of the evidence because it's a very normal thing, right? So it's very unattractive. So there's only a handful of companies that deliver most of the outcome, probably 3, right, in the entire region. But the reality is just it's a boring reality, right? And that's normal. That's absolutely fine. Second one, I think there's a difference between an overemphasis on agency and a focus on the individual holistically. So as a human being with emotions, with worries, with skills and competences, instead of overemphasizing the agencies or what the individual can do, perhaps it's about focusing on who is the individual, right? And what are the life circumstances. I think that's missing because we rely too much on agency, so perhaps it's less, and we have to take a look at the individual more holistically. And then strengthen the support structures. The problem is that we've created this layer of support that is now called like business support industry. So it's an industry in itself, right, and fairly large. And these are the ones that normally they act as a conduit, right, from policy into the individuals, right? So they channel all the support. What I'm meaning by support infrastructure is all the systems of support that the individual requires to be able to do whatever they want to do, right? So if you have a fixed support infrastructure, an industry that they're all doing exactly the same, it's very unlikely that outcomes will change. And we need to change the outcomes. If you look into well-being, we know if we have healthier individuals, they'll run healthier businesses, right? So there's no magic in that. And what's happened is that since we're doing all the same, the chances of having a different outcomes in terms of, like, for example, mental health outcomes, where reductions in the level of stress, reduction in the level of anxiety, even suicide rates, right, as a result of business ownership, we need to do something different. And that means a very different support structure.
Again, that leads me on very nicely. Obviously, both the national and regional policies do have a quite a wide-ranging set of ambitions and goals. And as you mentioned previously, they very rarely mention the human factor, the human being that is the founder. We know that burnout and mental strain are pervasive amongst founders in general, and in particular in the north of England, it's got some of the poorest levels of mental health. Under 25s are recording some really poor levels of well-being. Do you think enough's been done nationally and regionally to address the risks that are involved to the person when they're being encouraged to maybe start a business? Or is that getting lost in the desire to build the business? We lose sight of the fact there's a human being in the middle of it who might be finding things tough, and might have been finding things tough in the first place, and maybe thought that the silver bullet of working for yourself might help, and not fully understanding or comprehending how difficult it can be.
In the context of mental health and well-being, most of the support that is currently available from the top down, it's in understanding their organizations, and it could be companies or public sector organizations, and the way we offer support is in that context, right? I work in a university. If I have any issues, I can, fill in a form, and then I have a meeting with occupational health, and then there's a well-being plan and a stress reduction or stress management plan, and there's an entire system that gets triggered. Imagine you're running your business. Where's that form, right? Who do I speak to? And also in consideration that this is a very lonely journey. If you go back to COVID, right? So what happened with the fellow system? So halfway through, we had to figure out what to do with the founders, right? So how do we support them? And that's, I think, is a very good example that the systems of support are designed with conventional workplace environment in mind. And then there's the assumption that a startup, or as you create a new business, is a small version of a large corporation, where in reality it's very, very different. We don't understand the unique challenges that business owners and entrepreneurs face, and so far we've been unable to create and deliver adequate support in consideration of those unique challenges, right? So we have all the sort of a range of mechanisms available but again, with an understanding that they operate in a corporate organizational environment, nothing for small business owners. But again, imagine yourself, right? So I'm struggling. What do I do? I mean, obviously there's the GP and mental health support system that we know that not working particularly well. In a work setting, what do I do if I'm running a business by myself?
Very unlikely that somebody's going to have an employee assistance program if they're a window cleaner. I agree, most of it is designed and developed for a more traditional workplace. And until your business has grown to a certain size, it maybe doesn't quite suit what you need. And I think the psychological relationship that the business owner has with the business is very different to the relationship a manager has with the business. So it is very different, I think. So do you think that ignoring the well-being bit, or trying to patch up the well-being piece with traditional workplace methods, actually runs a risk of undermining all of the other aims and ambitions of the national and regional strategies.
I remember reading the new, at least the one that's under consultation, the Northeast Growth Strategy, I think that was called, right? No mention of any of this. Right? And we know that well-being is correlated with performance. So, like, we're missing a very important piece of the puzzle, right? So pay attention to the individual will likely do well.
So if you could advise the policymakers, you could have one piece of change to the policies at the national or regional level in terms of well-being this time, not just in the broader sense. But what would you like to see included in the strategies, in the policies, and in what's being delivered to business owners?
There's a reason why in this region a lot of people don't want to call themselves entrepreneurs, because that comes with a big bag. But the reality is the entrepreneurship is just a process. It's not a persona, it's not a personality. And then what you do in terms of action is largely depending on, as I mentioned before, on what you like, what you're passionate about. So what we're currently not encouraging is self-determination, because we're creating one image and letting people to self-determine. Meritocratic and neoliberal societies were supposed to encourage that, self-determination, a lot of human agency. But we created one image. And once you limit the funding mirroring that image, actually you're running counter to self-determination, right? So you see how the two clash. And then once you do that, because again, self-determination puts you in sometimes a very vulnerable positions, because you have to experiment and follow things that might not seem rational sometimes. A bit of self-care, knowing when to abandon, when to stop, when it's enough, when to push back. So self-care, self-respect, that if you don't do well, or if you don't grow tenfold in a year, that's absolutely fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Respecting people's journeys, I think that's good, because it's currently, as I mentioned before, right? So if you don't promise that tenfold growth, or if you don't promise a highly innovative, disruptive IP, you're not going to get the funding. And in a lot of cases, that delegitimizes your efforts. So the message is, you're not good enough. Right? You have to do more, you have to achieve more. There's something about respecting people's lives, right? But sometimes we just carry on repeating things that simply don't work. Diminishing people's self-worth, right? A sense of being valued as a human being when everyone's telling you, oh, your business is, right, not good enough. So respect personal aspirations, ambitions. That's a really interesting term, for example, because ambition is just your own internal drive and what you want to achieve in life. But if it's not big enough, people will come and tell you you're not ambitious enough, right? Well, we're all ambitious, but in different degrees. And that's something that we, again, don't pay attention to. It's a sort of a fixed idea of what ambition is, when reality is there's just variance. And again, this is a very diverse world, and we need to pay attention to that, right? So again, there's a handful of outliers that deliver most of the outcome, but then the reality is just a very, very long tail of different, normal, perhaps less shiny endeavors, like human endeavors. And that will continue regardless of what you promote. Especially in this region, right? So, I don't know, space economy and so on, when you have issues, when you have, for example, go to A-level or GCSE results, right? When there's no support and the region is lagging behind in certain indicators in comparison to the south, I mean, you can create that, but you don't have the structures to support that, right? I think there's structural issues that need to change. I think it's valuable, it's important to dream and aspire, and for this to be the AI region or the space region or whatever, but it doesn't really reflect the reality of this region. And that happens across the board, right? So if you go around the UK, they all want to be the AI region, right? So they go through hypes. It doesn't make so much sense because it doesn't really reflect the reality of that region. So there's no respect for traditions and culture, and it's not really embedded in what that society, and that creates a detachment. And we end up doing things that don't make any sense in the context of who they are.
Pablo, thank you for sharing your insights today and volunteering to sit in the hot seat. We've had a good chat there about national and regional policies and strategies. The key thing I'm taking away from that really is the human element is often missing and forgot about. And without a healthy founder, it's going to be very hard to have a healthy business. And we really need to look at the two together and not in isolation. So that's it, the end of episode 1 for the Founders Matter, where hopefully we've started to explain what matters to founders and why founders matter and why they're so important to their unique business journey, and the fact that, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't necessarily going to work. If you're interested, you can download a summary of the episode, all the stuff that we've discussed, all the research and theories that Pablo's touched on will be available. And again, you can sign up to our check-in emails where you'll get weekly questions, newsletters and other information. And we hope you join you next time on the Founders Matter podcast.